Get out! You cannot be a mom!
How could you say that?
Millionaire slapped her, said, "You can't be a mom." 10 years later, she came to his wedding with twins. "Hi, my beautiful story family. Welcome home to Mr. James Stories. Before we lose ourselves in today's journey, I want to take a moment for you. How is your heart truly doing today? If no one has reminded you today, let me be the one. You are precious, you are resilient, and your current struggle is not your final destination. May peace return to you, and may your struggles shrink in the face of hope. Drop a heart in the comments so I know you are here and that we are walking this path together. Let's set all that aside and dive into another story together. The autumn rain turned the marble steps of the Holloway estate into a slick, treacherous mirror, reflecting the cold, artificial glow of the crystal chandeliers inside. 10 years ago, the air had smelled exactly like this. A mixture of damp earth, expensive jasmine, and the sharp, metallic scent of Alistair Holloway's signature cologne. Nora Whitaker stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk, her designer heels clicking against the pavement with a rhythmic precision that masked the storm brewing in her chest. Across the street, a towering digital billboard displayed Alistair's face, smug and polished, announcing the wedding of the century to a woman whose dowry was meant to save his crumbling empire. Nora pulled her silk trench coat tighter, the fabric a soft, expensive whisper against her skin. She closed her eyes for a second, and suddenly, she wasn't the titan of medical research she was today. She was 21 again, wearing a stained apron in the Holloway kitchen, her voice trembling as she held out a positive pregnancy test in the dimly lit foyer. She could still feel the phantom heat of his palm against her cheek, the sharp, stinging crack that had echoed through the gala like a gunshot. "You think a kitchen rat like you can be a mother to a Holloway?" he had sneered, his eyes filled with a disgust so pure it felt like ice. He had leaned in, his voice a low, jagged blade. "You're a glitch in the timeline, Nora. You're nothing. This pregnancy is a lie, and if you ever show your face near my family again, I'll ensure you disappear for good." He had signaled the security guards then, watching with a bored, dismissive expression as they dragged her out into the downpour. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had tried to erase her existence. He thought he had won, unaware that his cruelty that night would become the very fuel that powered her ascent. But the man on that billboard didn't know that Nora Whitaker had spent the last decade becoming a ghost that haunted his balance sheets. He didn't know that the anonymous creditor, who had quietly purchased 40% of his family's distressed debt, was the same woman he had slapped into the mud. To Alistair, the world was a chessboard where he owned all the pieces, but he failed to realize that Nora had moved beyond the board entirely. The wind picked up, swirling the golden leaves of the city's park against her legs. Nora looked up at the Holloway penthouse, a monolith of glass and steel that symbolized everything Alistair prized: status, lineage, and the illusion of invincibility. He was a man who measured human worth in net worth, never realizing that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has nothing left to lose. A Blacktown car pulled up to the curb, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The window rolled down to reveal two small faces, a boy and a girl, both with the distinctive, piercing gray eyes that had been the Holloway trademark for generations. "Mommy," the boy Leo asked, his brow furrowed in a way that was hauntingly familiar. "Are we going in?" Nora looked at her children, her living miracles, and felt a surge of cold, calculated vindication. They were the physical evidence of the lie Alistair had told himself for 10 years. She reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing the velvet box that held her wedding gift for the groom. It wasn't silver or gold. It was the original, blood-stained apron she had kept for 3,650 days. "Not yet, Leo," Nora whispered, her gaze returning to the penthouse lights above. "We're going to wait until he thinks he's won, because that is when the fall hurts the most." Little did Alistair know, his signature on the wedding license tomorrow wouldn't be the start of a new life. It would be the final nail in the coffin of his old one. He believed he was marrying into safety, but he was actually walking into a trap set by the very woman he had discarded as trash. Nora watched a single raindrop trail down the glass of the car window. She had learned long ago that justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. Tomorrow, The elite of American society would gather to witness a union of power, but they would leave witnessing the total annihilation of a legacy. As the car pulled away, leaving the Holloway estate in the rearview mirror, Nora felt a sense of calm settle over her. The silent powerhouse was no longer silent. The storm wasn't just coming, she was the storm. And Alistair Holloway had nowhere left to hide. The Holloway headquarters stood like a jagged shard of obsidian against the gray New York skyline, a monument to a legacy built on the backs of others. Nora walked through the revolving glass doors, the lobby smelling of expensive floor wax and filtered air. She wore a pair of oversized dark glasses, blending into the morning rush of assistants and executives scurrying toward the elevators like ants in a glass farm. She took a seat in a velvet armchair in the far corner of the atrium, hidden behind a towering monstera plant. To the world, she was just another wealthy woman waiting for a meeting. To herself, she was a predator scouting the terrain. The wedding is the only thing keeping the creditors at bay, a hushed voice whispered nearby. Nora leaned back, her ears tuning into a pair of junior analysts standing by the espresso bar. If Alistair doesn't secure the merger by Friday, this whole building is going into receivership. He's desperate, the second analyst replied, glancing around nervously. I heard he's been trying to reach that new investment group, Whitaker Holdings, for weeks. They bought up the mezzanine debt, and they aren't answering his calls. Nora's lips curled into a microscopic smile. She was the one who had instructed her team to ignore Alistair's frantic messages. She wanted him to sweat. She wanted him to feel the walls closing in, just as she had felt them closing in 10 years ago when she was evicted from her studio apartment with a positive pregnancy test and $5 in her pocket. As she watched Alistair descend the grand staircase, looking every bit the golden boy in a tailored charcoal suit, she noticed the tremor in his hands as he checked his watch. He was a man drowning in silk, pretending he still owned the ocean. Nora stood up, her movement fluid and silent. She didn't approach him. Not yet. She simply walked past him, the scent of her jasmine perfume trailing behind her like a ghostly reminder of a woman he thought he had buried. Alistair froze, his head snapping toward her retreating back, a look of confused recognition flickering in his eyes before he shook it off. He thought he was seeing a ghost, unaware that the ghost now held the keys to his empire. Back in the sanctuary of her penthouse, Nora sat across from her lead counsel, a man who dealt in the destruction of dynasties. On the marble table between them lay the final foreclosure notices for the Holloway estate. It's done, Nora, the lawyer said, sliding a gold fountain pen toward her. The moment you sign these, you own the debt, the land, and the branding rights. Alistair Holloway is technically working for you, and he doesn't even know it. Nora picked up the pen, the weight of it satisfying in her hand. And the wedding venue. The church and the reception hall are part of the historical trust Alistair used as collateral, the lawyer confirmed. You are effectively his landlord for the wedding of the century. Nora signed her name with a flourish. The open loop was nearly closed. She wasn't just taking his money, she was taking his dignity. She thought of the twins in the next room, oblivious to the fact that their mother was about to dismantle their father's world. She opened a leather-bound file on the table, a private investigator's report on Alistair's fiancée, Bianca. The woman was a social climber who believed she was marrying into a fortune. Bianca's father, a billionaire in his own right, had no idea he was about to link his name to a sinking ship. Nora closed the file. She wouldn't warn them. The higher they climbed, the more spectacular the crash would be. The evening sun cast long, amber shadows across the living room as Leo and Mia sat on the floor, surrounded by old photographs. Nora watched them from the doorway, her heart aching with a mixture of love and protective fury. Mommy, look, Mia said, holding up a tablet. She had found an article about the upcoming Holloway wedding. This man, he has our eyes. Nora knelt beside her daughter, her voice soft but firm. Many people have gray eyes, sweetheart. But it's the same shape, too, Leo added, his young face uncharacteristically serious. And the crest on the building in the picture, it's the same one I saw in your old locket. The room went silent, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock. Nora realized she couldn't hide the truth much longer. Her children were too smart, too much like her, to be shielded from the reality of their lineage. That man, Nora said, her voice steady, is someone who didn't believe in the power of family. He thought people were things you could throw away when they were no longer useful. Is he a bad man? Mia asked. Nora tucked a stray hair behind her daughter's ear. He is a man who is about to learn a very expensive lesson. And you two are the reason he's going to learn it. As she tucked them into bed that night, Nora looked at the Holloway crest birthmark on Leo's shoulder, a rare genetic trait passed down through generations. It was the ultimate micro-hook, the one piece of evidence Alistair could never explain away in front of a crowd. Tomorrow, the games would truly begin. The charity auction for the Children's Hospital was held in a ballroom that dripped with the kind of billionaire justice atmosphere Nora had once only seen from the service entrance. Gold-leafed columns reached toward vaulted ceilings, and the air was thick with the scent of gardenias and the sharp, ozone tang of expensive champagne. Nora moved through the crowd like a phantom in a gown of liquid moonlight, charcoal silk that caught every flicker of the candlelight. She wasn't just here to bid. She was here to witness the fear in Alistair Holloway's eyes. Alistair was standing near the bar, surrounded by a circle of sycophants who laughed too loudly at his jokes. He looked polished, but Nora's trained eye saw the cracks. The way he checked his reflection in every passing tray, the slight sheen of sweat on his upper lip despite the air conditioning. He was a man who believed his lineage granted him godhood, yet he was currently one missed payment away from being a pariah. As Nora approached, the circle parted. She didn't look at his friends. She kept her gaze fixed on him. The recognition didn't hit him all at once. It was a slow, agonizing realization. He saw a powerful woman, a titan of industry, but beneath the diamond earrings and the flawless makeup, a memory was clawing its way to the surface. He remembered a rain-slicked night and a girl in a stained apron. "Alistair," she said, her voice like velvet wrapped around a blade. "It's been a long time." He blinked, his glass trembling slightly. Do I know you? You knew me well enough to tell me I was nothing," she whispered, leaning in so only he could hear. "You said I was a glitch in your timeline. But it turns out, Alistair, I'm the one who's been writing your history for the last 10 years. He laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Nora? The kitchen girl? You've certainly done well for yourself, though I suspect you found a wealthy benefactor to pay for that dress. Why are you here? Looking for a handout? I told you 10 years ago, you can't be a mother to a Holloway, and you certainly can't sit at our table." Nora didn't flinch. She simply smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. "I don't need to sit at your table, Alistair. I already bought the table, and the chairs, and the building they're sitting in." Before he could respond, the auctioneer called for the next item, the Holloway family's ancestral locket, a piece Alistair had been forced to consign to cover his mounting debts. Alistair's face went pale. He had planned to have a friend bid on it to keep it in the family. "Shall we see who has the real power tonight?" Nora asked, her eyes flashing with a silent power. Alistair stepped forward, his ego forcing him into a battle he couldn't win. He opened the bidding at $50,000, his voice cracking. The room went silent as Nora calmly raised her paddle. $500,000, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. The gasps from the elite crowd were like music to her ears. Alistair looked as though he had been struck again, but this time, the blow was to his pride. He turned to look at her, his mouth hanging open, realization finally dawning on him. She wasn't just back. She was in control. Little did he know, this bid was only the first of many things she would take from him tonight. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a finality that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Sold. To the lady in the charcoal silk for $500,000. Alistair stood frozen as the room erupted into whispers. The Holloway name, once synonymous with untouchable wealth, had just been publicly humbled by a woman no one recognized. He pushed through the crowd, his face flushed a deep, ugly red. He cornered Nora near the terrace, where the cold night air offered no relief from the heat of his humiliation. "What is this, Nora? Some kind of sick revenge fantasy?" he hissed, his status-obsessed mind unable to process the shift in dynamic. "You think throwing money around makes you one of us? You're still just the girl who scrubbed my floors. You'll never have the blood, the legacy." "Blood is just a biological fact, Alistair," Nora replied, stepping closer until she could smell the gin on his breath. "And legacy? Your legacy is a pile of debt and a wedding you can't afford. You call me trash, yet here you are, begging for air in a room I now own. She watched his eyes dart around, looking for an escape, for a way to regain his footing. He was the classic, arrogant bully, but he had forgotten that bullies only thrive when their victims stay afraid. Nora was no longer afraid. She felt a profound sense of peace as she looked at him, not the giant he once seemed, but a small, desperate man clinging to a fading title. I'm getting married in 3 days, Alistair said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. To Bianca Thorne. Her father will crush you for this disrespect. Nora laughed softly. Bianca Thorne's father is currently in a meeting with my CFO. He's trying to figure out why his future son-in-law's company has a foreclosure sign taped to the digital backend. You haven't told her, have you? You haven't told her that the Holloway estate is collateral for a loan that has already been called in. Alistair's knees buckled, and he had to reach out to a stone balustrade to steady himself. Who are you? He whispered, the arrogance finally stripped away to reveal a hollow core. I'm the woman who didn't disappear, Nora said. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a business card, not for her research firm, but for the holding company that owned his debt. I'm your landlord, Alistair, and your wedding venue is currently under new management. I'd suggest you keep the champagne chilled. I'm coming to the wedding, and I'm bringing the guest you tried so hard to forget. She walked away then, her heels clicking a steady, victorious beat against the marble. She could feel his eyes on her, a mixture of rage and terror. He thought he had won the moment he cast her out, unaware that every struggle she faced over the last decade was a brick in the fortress she had built to house his downfall. The following morning, the Holloway Library felt more like a tomb than a place of study. Alistair sat behind the massive mahogany desk, his head in his hands. His father, Arthur Holloway, stood by the window, looking out at the city they were losing. The room was sensory-rich with the smell of old paper and the cold, stale scent of expensive cigars. They've frozen the accounts, Alistair, Arthur said, his voice sounding brittle. Every single one. The Whitaker Group, they own it all. Who are these people? I've never heard of a Whitaker Titan in this city. Alistair didn't look up. It's her, father. The girl from 10 years ago. Nora. Arthur turned, his eyes narrowing. The kitchen girl? Impossible. She disappeared. You told me you took care of it. I thought I did, Alistair groaned. But she's back. She bought the locket last night. She knows everything. She knows about the insolvency. She knows we're broke. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. The billionaire justice atmosphere had turned sour, the polished wood and silk drapes now feeling like a cage. Alistair realized that his only hope was the marriage. If he could just get through the ceremony and merge his name with the Thorne fortune, he might be able to buy Nora off. But Nora was 3 steps ahead. At that very moment, she was sitting in her own office, looking at the security footage from 10 years ago. The graininess of the video didn't hide the brutality of Alistair's slap or the coldness of his words. This decision would haunt him forever. She looked at the twins, who were playing quietly on the rug with a set of wooden blocks. They were the open loop Alistair couldn't close. They were the living proof of his lies. Is it time, Mommy? Mia asked, looking up with those piercing Holloway eyes. Nora closed the laptop. Almost, sweetheart. We just have to let the groom get his suit ready. He needs to look his best for the day he loses everything. Nora felt a pang of something, not regret, but a deep, empathetic weight for the girl she used to be. She wasn't doing this just for revenge. She was doing it so that no other woman would ever have to stand in the rain while a man like Alistair told her she was nothing. The ending would be vindicating, but the journey there required a slow-burn intensity that Alistair wasn't prepared for. The invitation sat on Nora's mahogany desk, a heavy slab of cream cardstock with gold-embossed edges that felt like a relic of a dying era. It was an exercise in vanity, listing the union of the Holloway and Thorne dynasties, in a font so delicate it was almost unreadable. Bianca Thorne had sent it personally, accompanied by a handwritten note on scented stationery. To the mysterious Nora Whitaker. It's always a pleasure to welcome new money into the fold. Do come. It would be such a charity. Nora traced the gold lettering with her thumb. Bianca was a woman who navigated high society with the grace of a shark, unaware that she was swimming in a tank that Nora had already drained. She believed she was the one bestowing a favor by inviting Nora to the wedding of the century. a typical dismissive move from the elite who view newcomers as trash. The room was silent, save for the soft crackle of the fireplace. The scent of expensive jasmine and old library leather filled the air, a sensory-rich atmosphere that Nora had once only dreamed of while scrubbing floors in Alistair's estate. She remembered the cold marble of the Holloway kitchen, the way the dampness would seep into her bones during the late-night shifts. Now, she was the one who controlled the temperature, the lighting, and the destiny of everyone mentioned on that card. She thinks she's a predator, Nora whispered to the empty room. She doesn't realize she's just decorative trim on a sinking ship. Nora's gaze shifted to the window, watching the rain-slicked streets of New York far below. She knew Alistair was counting on this wedding to stay afloat. He was using Bianca's dowry like a life raft, but he hadn't checked the bottom of the boat for holes. This decision to involve the Thorne family would haunt him forever. Nora had already made sure that the moment the vows were exchanged, the Thorne family's legal team would receive a comprehensive dossier on Alistair's true financial state. She picked up a gold fountain pen and checked the will attend box. The silent powerhouse was ready to make her move. She wouldn't just be an attendee. She would be the architect of the evening's ruin. Leaving her penthouse, Nora instructed her driver to take the long way, past the corner of 5th and 72nd. She rolled down the window, letting the biting autumn air hit her face. This was the spot. 10 years ago, the security guards had dropped her right here, her knees hitting the wet asphalt while Alistair watched from the warmth of his foyer. She could still feel the phantom sting of the cold rain mixing with the warmth of her own tears. She stepped out of the car, her Italian silk coat fluttering in the wind. She stood there for a long moment, a woman of immense power standing in the exact place where she had been treated like a nothing. A passerby might have seen a beautiful billionaire lost in thought, but Nora was revisiting the moment her resilience was forged. "Ma'am, are you all right?" her driver, Marcus, asked, his voice full of the quiet respect she earned from everyone who worked for her. "I'm more than all right, Marcus," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm remembering why I started." She walked toward a small, unassuming cafe nearby, the place where she had spent her last $5 on a cup of tea to stop the shaking in her hands that night. She found the old owner, a man named Elias, still behind the counter. He didn't recognize the polished woman in front of him, but he remembered the story. "You're the girl from the rain," he whispered when she finally spoke. "I kept the footage, you know. The security camera outside. I saw what that man did to you. I always hoped you'd come back for it." Nora felt a surge of cold, calculated vindication. This was the micro hook she needed. The physical evidence of the slap. Elias handed her a small, dusty thumb drive. "I didn't want him to get away with it," Elias said. "Men like that think the world is their playground, and we're just the equipment." Nora thanked him, leaving a tip that would pay for his retirement tenfold. As she walked back to the car, she felt the weight of the drive in her pocket. Alistair thought he had deleted the past. He thought he had scrubbed his glitch in the timeline away. But Nora was about to play that glitch on every screen in the Holloway ballroom. Back at her estate, Nora retreated to her private dressing room, a sanctuary of marble and mirrors. In the very back of a cedar-lined closet sat a small, battered suitcase. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper, was the white apron she had worn a decade ago. It was yellowed with age, and if you looked closely, you could still see the faint, brownish stains of blood from where her lip had caught her teeth during the slap. She pulled it out, the fabric feeling rough and alien against her current life of luxury. This was her secret twist. To Alistair, the past was a nuisance to be ignored. To Nora, this apron was a holy relic of her survival. "You said I couldn't be a mother," she whispered, looking at her reflection. "You said I was a glitch." She began to pack a gift box, the finest silver paper, a ribbon made of hand-spun silk. Inside, she placed the apron and a copy of the paternity results she had kept hidden for 10 years. This wasn't just a gift, it was a subpoena for his conscience. She knew that when Alistair opened this in front of his new bride and the cameras, his carefully constructed Ice King persona would shatter. Her children, Leo and Mia, entered the room, their laughter echoing off the cold marble walls. They were the dignified result of her resilience. They were beautiful, smart, and they possessed the Holloway gray eyes that would soon be Alistair's undoing. "Is that for the wedding, Mommy?" Mia asked, pointing to the silver box. Yes, sweetheart, Nora said, her eyes softening as she looked at her daughter. It's a reminder that the truth always finds its way home. No matter how much rain falls, the sun eventually comes out. Nora felt a final, bracing sense of purpose. The billionaire justice atmosphere was set. The open loops were primed. Little did Alistair know, his wedding day wouldn't be a celebration of a new beginning, but a public execution of his reputation. The penthouse Nora occupied was a sanctuary of cold marble and polished chrome, but the documents spread across her desk were anything but sterile. She had spent the last hour dissecting the life of Bianca Thorne, the woman Alistair intended to marry to save his dying legacy. To the public, Bianca was the epitome of American high society, a woman of grace and immense family wealth. But Nora's private investigators had found the hairline fractures in the Thorne family's golden image. Bianca wasn't marrying Alistair for love. She was marrying him for a title she believed still carried weight. Her own father's venture capital firm was under federal investigation for predatory lending, and she needed the Holloway name, a name associated with old-world stability, to shield her assets from seizure. They were two predators circling one another, both unaware that the Ice King and his bride were actually two drowning people trying to use the other as a flotation device. Nora paced the length of her office, the city lights below reflecting in the floor-to-ceiling windows like fallen stars. The scent of her expensive jasmine perfume filled the room, a sharp contrast to the stale, metallic smell of the Holloway kitchen she remembered so vividly. She had the power to stop this wedding right now. She could call Bianca and reveal Alistair's insolvency, or call the feds and accelerate the Thorne investigation. But where is the justice in a quiet ending? Nora whispered to the glass. She knew the ending had to be vindicating. The villain had to be publicly exposed and humiliated. If she stopped the wedding now, Alistair would simply slink away into a different shadow. No, she would let them stand at the altar. She would let them exchange vows built on lies, and only then would she pull the rug out from under both of them. This decision would haunt him forever. She returned to her desk and picked up a photograph of the twins. They were the open loop that Alistair thought he had closed with a single slap 10 years ago. Little did he know that slap hadn't just ended her youth. It had started her empire. The clock in Alistair's study chimed 3 in the morning, the sound heavy and mournful in the silent house. He sat alone, a glass of amber scotch trembling in his hand. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Nora's face from the auction, not the terrified girl from the rain, but a silent powerhouse who looked at him with a pity that felt worse than hate. He picked up his phone and dialed the number on the card she had given him. He didn't expect anyone to answer, but on the third ring, the line clicked open. There was no greeting, only a heavy, expectant silence. "Nora," he rasped, his voice sounding thin and old. "I know it's you. I know you're the one behind Whitaker Holdings. You're calling your landlord very late, Alistair." A voice replied. It was distorted, modulated through a software that made her sound like a cold, digital entity. "Is there a problem with the property?" "Stop this," Alistair hissed, his arrogance flaring up like a dying candle. "You want money? I'll give you a settlement. More than you could ever make in 100 years of scrubbing floors. Just stay away from the wedding. Stay away from Bianca. You still think everything has a price, don't you?" Nora's voice, though distorted, carried a chilling weight of success. "You think you can pay for the 10 years I spent wondering if I could afford milk for my children? You think you can settle for the slap that nearly broke my jaw? I was protecting my legacy." Alistair shouted into the empty room. "Your legacy is a fiction," she replied. "And tomorrow, the world is going to read the final chapter. I'm not coming for your money, Alistair. I already have all of it. I'm coming for the one thing you can't buy back, your pride." The line went dead. Alistair stared at the screen, the blue light casting long, skeletal shadows across his face. He felt a cold dread settle in his marrow. He thought he had won when he discarded her, unaware that he was just a man signing a document that would eventually cost him his freedom. He realized then that he wasn't the hunter in this story. He was the prey, and the trap was already set. The next morning, a courier arrived at the Holloway estate with a thick, manila envelope. Alistair opened it with shaking fingers, hoping for a reprieve. Instead, he found a surrender agreement. The terms were brutal. In exchange for a temporary stay on the foreclosure of the Holloway family home, Just enough time to get through the wedding. Alastair had to sign over his remaining personal shares and his seats on the board of every subsidiary. He was being asked to strip himself naked, metaphorically, before he even walked down the aisle. The document was written in a cold, polished prose that echoed the Ice King persona Alastair had cultivated for years, but the signature at the bottom was Whitaker. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Nora was giving him a choice: lose everything now and cancel the wedding in shame, or sign the paper, keep the illusion of his status for one more day, and walk into her trap. He looked around the library, the leather-bound books, the marble fireplace, the portraits of his ancestors. If he didn't sign, the locks would be changed by noon. He would have to tell Bianca's father that he was a pauper. "I'll sign," he whispered to the empty room. He took his gold pen and scrawled his name, unaware that his signature on this document was the final act of his own destruction. He believed he was buying time. He didn't realize he was just paying for the front-row seat to his own public execution. Nora, watching the confirmation of the digital signature from her office, leaned back in her Italian silk chair. She felt no joy, only a profound sense of billionaire justice. This silent powerhouse had finally spoken, and the echo was going to bring the whole house down. The sun rose over Manhattan like a cold, polished coin, casting long, skeletal shadows across Nora's penthouse suite. The air inside was heavy with the scent of lilies and the sharp, crisp ozone of a storm that had passed, but left the world feeling fragile. Nora stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her reflection a testament to a decade of silent, relentless building. She wasn't just a woman getting dressed. She was a commander donning armor for the final assault. Her gown was a masterpiece of liquid moonlight, charcoal silk that clung to her frame with an expensive, understated grace. Every stitch represented a hurdle she had cleared, and every diamond in her ears was a tear she had refused to shed in the dark. She moved with a dignified resilience, her fingers steady as she fastened a necklace of black pearls, jewels formed by irritation and time, much like her own power. In the next room, she could hear the soft murmurs of Leo and Mia. She had chosen their outfits with painstaking care, a miniature charcoal suit for Leo and a matching silk dress for Mia. They were the open loop that Alastair believed he had closed with a single, brutal act 10 years ago. "Today, we claim our name," Nora whispered to her reflection, her voice a low, melodic promise. She reached for the silver gift box on her vanity, the one containing the blood-stained apron from her past. It felt surprisingly light, considering the weight of the memories it held. She knew that by the time the sun set, the Holloway name would no longer belong to the man who had dragged it through the mud of his own arrogance. It would belong to the children who carried his eyes, but none of his cruelty. The St. Jude's Cathedral was a fortress of Gothic stone and stained glass, surrounded by a sea of paparazzi and black SUVs. The wedding of the century had drawn the elite of American society, a crowd of people who measured worth in zip codes and heritage. Alastair stood at the top of the steps, flashing a practiced, plastic smile for the cameras, his hands buried deep in his pockets to hide the tremor that had plagued him since Nora's phone call. The atmosphere was electric with the scent of expensive perfume and the hum of 1,000 hushed secrets. But the chatter died down the moment a sleek, matte black limousine pulled to the curb. It wasn't the bride. The door opened, and Nora stepped out, followed by two children who looked like they had been carved from the very history of the Holloway family. The paparazzi went into a frenzy, their flashes like strobe lights against the gray stone of the cathedral. The elite guests whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes darting from the stunning woman in charcoal silk to the children with the unmistakable Holloway eyes. Nora didn't stop for the cameras. She walked up the steps with a slow-burn intensity that forced the crowd to part like the Red Sea. She stopped just inches from Alastair. The arrogant bully looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped, revealing the hollow, terrified man beneath. "You're late, Nora," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the clicking of shutters. "Actually, Alastair," she replied, her eyes as cold as the marble beneath them. "I'm right on time to see the end of an era." She didn't wait for his response. She led her children into the cathedral, leaving the Ice King standing in the cold, realizing that his guest of honor was actually his executioner. Inside, The cathedral was a cavern of golden light and hushed anticipation. Nora took her seat in the very front row, the family side, directly in Alastair's line of sight. The air smelled of incense and old wood, a sensory-rich environment that felt more like a courtroom than a sanctuary. The organ music began, a swelling, dramatic melody that filled the vast space. But Nora didn't look back to see the bride. Her gaze was fixed on Alastair, who stood at the altar looking like a ghost in a tuxedo. Every time he glanced her way, he saw the twins, two living rebukes to the lie he had lived for a decade. He thought he had won when he cast her out, unaware that his cruelty had birthed the very force that was now suffocating him. The curiosity gap in the room was palpable. The Thorne family sat across the aisle, their faces tight with a growing sense of unease. They had noticed the children. They had noticed the way Alastair's eyes kept darting to the woman in charcoal. As the priest began the ceremony, Nora leaned forward, her voice a mere ghost of a sound that seemed to carry through the silence of the cathedral. "You said I'd never be a mom, Alastair," she whispered, her words timed perfectly with a lull in the music. The color drained from Alastair's face so completely he looked like he might faint. He stumbled over the first line of his vows, his voice cracking in front of the most powerful people in the country. This silent powerhouse had finally spoken within the walls of his own sanctuary, and the foundation of the Holloway Empire began to crack in real time. The vaulted ceilings of the cathedral seemed to press down on Alastair as he stood at the altar, his breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. The scent of lilies, which usually symbolized purity, now felt cloying and funereal, like the air in a tomb. He looked down at the front row, and for the first time in 10 years, he truly saw Nora Whitaker. She wasn't the blurry memory of a kitchen hand anymore. She was a portrait of cold, untouchable success. Her charcoal silk dress shimmered under the stained glass light, looking like armor forged in the fires of his own rejection. Beside her, the twin sat with a stillness that was haunting. The boy, Leo, tilted his head just a fraction of an inch. A gesture so identical to Alastair's own father that it felt like a physical blow to the chest. Alastair's status-obsessed mind raced, trying to find a way to spin this, to claim these children were an elaborate hoax, but the physical evidence was undeniable. They possessed the Holloway eyes, a rare, piercing gray that had been the pride of his lineage for 2 centuries. The priest cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the hushed silence of the gathered elite. "Alastair Holloway," the old man prompted, his voice carrying a note of confusion as he looked at the groom's ashen face. Alastair tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with the very rain that had fallen the night he cast Nora out. He realized, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that the titan who owned his debt and the trash he had slapped were the same person. He wasn't standing at the start of a new life. He was standing at the end of his rope. Bianca Thorne walked down the aisle, a vision of white lace and calculated ambition, but Alastair barely noticed her. His eyes were locked on Nora, who sat with a dignified resilience that made the rest of the room look small. As Bianca reached the altar and took his hand, her brow furrowed. His palm was slick with cold sweat. She leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper beneath the swell of the organ music. "Alastair, what is wrong with you? Everyone is staring." Alastair didn't answer. He couldn't. He was listening to the ghost of his own voice from a decade ago, telling Nora she was nothing. Now, nothing was sitting in the seat of honor, watching him crumble in a $10,000 suit. The curiosity gap in the cathedral was reaching a breaking point. The Thorne family was already whispering, their heads bowed in urgent, frantic consultation as they looked at the twins in the front row. The priest began the vows, but every word felt like a lie being etched into stone. When it came time for Alastair to speak, Nora leaned forward just an inch, her gaze never wavering. "You said I'd never be a mom, Alastair," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to cut through the heavy air of the sanctuary. The words hit him with more force than the slap he had given her. He stumbled, his voice cracking as he tried to recite the promises of a husband. He was a man signing a contract he had already breached, unaware that his signature today was merely a confession of his own insolvency and cruelty. The ceremony reached the point of no return, but before the rings could be exchanged, the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral creaked open. It wasn't a guest arriving late. It was Nora's assistant, carrying a silver screen projector that had been authorized as a special presentation for the guests. The atmosphere shifted from a wedding to a public execution. Nora stood up, her movement fluid and silent, drawing the eyes of every billionaire and socialite in the room. Alastair likes to talk about legacy, Nora said, her voice clear and carrying to the very back of the hall. He likes to talk about who deserves to carry a name and who is merely a glitch in the timeline. She looked at the twins, then back to the altar. But legacy isn't something you inherit by birthright while stepping on the people who built you. It's something you earn through truth. On the large screens flanking the altar, a grainy video began to play. The security footage from 10 years ago. The room gasped as they saw a younger Alastair strike a girl in a kitchen apron and sneer that she was trash. The silent powerhouse had finally unleashed the truth. Alastair's father-in-law stood up, his face a mask of purple rage, realizing that the man his daughter was marrying wasn't an ice king, but a common bully who had bankrupted his soul long before he bankrupted his company. The ending was no longer a mystery. It was a looming, vindicating justice that would leave Alastair with nothing but the echo of his own cruelty. The grainy footage on the massive digital screens flickered with a haunting clarity, the sound of the slap echoing through the hallowed, vaulted ceilings of the cathedral like a thunderclap in a silent tomb. Alastair's father, Arthur Halloway, stood frozen in the front pew, his spine stiffening as the prestige he had spent 70 years cultivating was incinerated in a matter of seconds. The elite of New York, the judges, the senators, the old money titans, all leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the blue light of Alastair's own cruelty. Arthur's gaze shifted from the screen to the two children standing beside Nora with a terrifyingly still dignity. The resemblance was no longer a question. It was a physical assault on his senses. He saw his own father's stubborn brow in the young boy, Leo, and the piercing, slate-gray eyes that had been the Halloway trademark for 2 centuries, a trait Alastair had claimed would never belong to the trash he discarded. The silent powerhouse had not only returned from the dead, she had brought the living evidence of the Halloway bloodline to claim what was theirs. Alastair, Arthur's voice boomed, a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to make the very floorboards tremble. He turned to his son, his eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. Explain this. Explain why I am watching a video of my son assaulting a woman in our own home. Explain why these children have my father's face. Alastair tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with the bitter ash of his own lies. He looked at Bianca, his bride, whose face had twisted from bridal bliss into a mask of absolute, curdled loathing. She wasn't looking at him with love. She was looking at a social liability. The billionaire justice atmosphere had shifted. The scent of expensive lilies now felt like the cloying smell of a funeral. He realized, with a sickening lurch of his heart, that no amount of status or offshore accounts could erase the physical evidence of his arrogance. He had called Nora nothing, but as he stood at the altar, stripped of his secrets, he was the one who felt empty. Nora stepped forward, her charcoal silk dress catching the flickering candlelight and turning her into a figure of liquid shadow and moonlight. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her quiet, resilient presence commanded the entire cathedral, silencing even the most frantic whispers of the socialites. From her clutch, she pulled a set of certified documents, the heavy gold seals of the city's most prestigious forensic laboratory gleaming under the overhead chandeliers. 10 years ago, Alastair Halloway claimed these children were a lie, Nora said, her voice steady and clear, carrying to the very back of the hall where the press was already beginning to scramble. He told me that a woman of my station, a kitchen rat, as he so eloquently put it, could never be a mother to a Halloway heir. He believed that wealth granted him the power to rewrite reality. But biology is a ledger that cannot be cooked. She handed the papers to the priest, whose hands trembled so violently that the parchment rattled against the mahogany pulpit. The curiosity gap in the room was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure as every guest waited for the verdict. The priest adjusted his glasses, his eyes widening as he scanned the data. The probability of paternity was not just a suggestion, it was a mathematical certainty of 99.9%. The crowd erupted into a cacophony of gasps and outraged murmurs. The Ice King had been unmasked not just as a failure, but as a coward who feared his own legacy. Alistair's father-in-law, a man who prized his family's reputation above his own soul, stepped toward the altar, his eyes fixed on the documents. He realized that the Thorne name was being dragged into a scandal that would haunt them for generations. Little did he know, this was only the first layer of the trap Nora had set for the man who thought he was untouchable. Nora didn't use her hand to strike Alistair. She didn't need to stoop to the level of the man who had once tried to break her spirit with a single, brutal blow. Instead, she used the weight of 10 years of cold, calculated success to deliver a psychological strike that was far more devastating. She walked toward the altar, her heels clicking against the marble with the precision of a ticking clock. She stopped just inches from Alistair, the scent of her jasmine perfume mixing with the cold, metallic tang of his sweat. "You told me I would disappear, Alistair," she whispered, her words a low, melodic vibration that seemed to cut through his very soul. "You thought that by casting me out into the rain, you could erase the consequence of your actions. But while you were busy playing the part of the untouchable prince, I was busy buying the kingdom you thought was your birthright." She reached into her bag and pulled out the small, silver-wrapped gift box, the one she had carried like a weapon. She placed it on the altar, directly on top of the Holloway family Bible, a symbolic gesture of the truth replacing the lie. Alistair stared at it, his face a ghostly white, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the altar for support. "Open it, Alistair," she commanded, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. With fumbling fingers, he tore the ribbon. Inside lay the yellowed, blood-stained apron, the garment she had been wearing the night he struck her. The room went deathly silent as he held up the piece of cheap, stained cotton. It was a sensory-rich reminder of his true character, a piece of the past that no amount of Holloway gold could ever clean. This silent powerhouse had finally delivered her final argument, and the verdict was written in the disgusted glares of his peers. Alistair Holloway had spent his life looking down on others, but in this moment, he was the smallest man in the room. The air in the cathedral grew heavy, thick with the scent of lilies that now felt more like a funeral arrangement than a wedding bouquet. Alistair stood at the altar, clutching the blood-stained apron as if it were a curse, while the elite of the city watched him with the cold detachment they reserved for a fallen titan. Nora took a slow, deliberate step back, her charcoal silk gown catching the light of the stained glass, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire sanctuary. "Alistair, you spent 10 years believing that your name was a shield," Nora began, her voice steady and echoing against the stone pillars. "You believed that because you were a Holloway, the world would always bow to you, regardless of who you crushed under your feet. But while you were focused on the prestige of your lineage, you forgot to check the foundation of your house." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a single, embossed document, a legal notice with the seal of the city's housing authority. "I didn't just come here to show you the children you rejected. I came here to serve you. This church, the estate you call home, and the very building you work in have all been consolidated under Whitaker Holdings." The silence that followed was deafening. Alistair's father-in-law, a man who measured loyalty and equity, snatched the paper from Nora's hand. As he read the foreclosure notice, his face turned a deep, bruised purple. Nora had quietly purchased the mezzanine debt Alistair had used to keep his lifestyle afloat, and as of 9 a.m. that morning, the grace period had expired. "You're a tenant, Alistair," Nora whispered, her eyes shining with a quiet, vindicating power. "And as the owner of this property, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to vacate the premises immediately. The wedding of the century is over. This is now a private eviction." Alistair looked around at the guests, the billionaires who were already reaching for their coats, the socialites who were deleting his number from their phones, and realized that the nothing he had created 10 years ago had just taken everything he had left. This decision to cast her out had finally come to collect its debt. Bianca Thorne stood at the altar, her white lace veil fluttering in the drafty air of the cathedral, looking like a statue of ice. She had spent a lifetime calculating the value of her name, and she realized in a heartbeat that being Mrs. Alistair Holloway was now a liability she could not afford. She looked at Alistair, the man who was supposed to be her ticket to a social merger, and saw only a broke, humiliated bully. "Father," Bianca said, her voice sharp and cold as a winter wind, I believe we're in the wrong church." She didn't look back. She didn't offer a word of comfort or even a parting glance of pity. She simply gathered her silk train and began the long walk back down the aisle, her heels clicking a rhythmic beat of abandonment against the marble floor. Her father followed close behind, pausing only to spit a final, disgusted insult at Alistair before the doors of the cathedral swung shut behind them. The guests followed suit, a mass exodus of silk and wool that left the sanctuary feeling cavernous and hollow. Alistair was left standing at the altar with only the priest and the woman he had once tried to destroy. The Ice King was alone in a room he no longer owned, facing the consequences of a decade of arrogance. Nora watched him, her expression one of dignified resilience. She felt no need to scream or mock him. The silence of the empty cathedral was the loudest indictment possible. She had fought back with success and silence, and the result was more devastating than any physical blow could ever be. She reached out and took the twins' hands, her touch gentle and protective, a stark contrast to the violence Alistair had shown her in that very spot 10 years ago. 3 hours later, the lights in the Holloway executive suite were dim, the only illumination coming from the golden hour sun setting behind the skyline. Alistair had retreated to his office, hoping to find some vestige of the power he once held, but his keycard had already been deactivated. He sat in the chair in the lobby, the same chair Nora had occupied earlier that week, waiting for the person who now held his life in her hands. The elevator dinked, and Nora stepped out. She wasn't wearing the charcoal silk anymore. She was in a sharp, tailored black suit that screamed authority. Behind her walked a team of auditors and security personnel, their footsteps echoing with a finality that made Alistair's stomach churn. "You can't do this, Nora," Alistair rasped, his eyes bloodshot and his suit rumpled. "This is my family's legacy. My grandfather built this company. Your grandfather built it, and you broke it," Nora replied, walking past him into the office that used to be his. She sat behind the mahogany desk, her presence filling the room with the billionaire justice atmosphere he had so recently abused. "You broke it when you decided that people were disposable. You broke it when you decided that you were above the truth." She slid a final document across the desk, a total surrender of his remaining personal assets in exchange for her not pursuing criminal charges for the financial discrepancies her auditors had already found. Alistair looked at the pen, a gold-plated instrument that felt like a lead weight. He realized that Nora wasn't just his landlord, she was his judge. "Sign it, Alistair," she said, her voice a calm, low melody. "Sign it and walk away with what's left of your dignity. Or don't, and let the world see the rest of the files I have in this drawer." Alistair's hand shook as he scrawled his name on the paper. He was signing away his penthouse, his cars, and his status, the only things he had ever valued. As he stood up to leave, Nora didn't even look at him. She was already focused on the future, a future where her children would never have to hear the word nothing used as a weapon. The following Monday, the glass doors of Holloway headquarters, now officially rebranded as Whitaker Plaza, swung open to a scene Alistair had never envisioned in his darkest nightmares. He was forced to return one final time, not as the heir apparent, but as a man under supervision. Nora stood in the center of the lobby, surrounded by the very security staff Alistair had once treated like invisible furniture. The atmosphere was cold, polished, and expensive, yet Alistair felt like he was walking through an industrial freezer. "You have 30 minutes to clear your personal effects," Nora said, her voice a calm, melodic vibration that carried across the vast marble expanse. She wasn't shouting, but the silence that followed her words was more deafening than any scream. Every employee he had ever belittled, every assistant he had ever ignored, was now standing in the mezzanine, watching his walk of shame. Alistair's hands shook as he reached for a cardboard box. He had to pack his hand-carved nameplate, his crystal awards, and the framed photos of his elite social circle. As he moved through the office, Nora followed 3 steps behind, a silent powerhouse ensuring he felt the weight of every eye on his back. He tried to maintain his Ice King composure, but without the title and the bank account, he was just a man in a rumpled suit carrying a box of junk. When he reached the elevator, he saw a group of interns he had fired the month before, now being interviewed for rehire by Nora's team. One of them didn't even look up. He simply held the door open for Alistair with a look of bored pity. The arrogant bully had been reduced to an anecdote, a cautionary tale of what happens when status is built on a foundation of sand. While Alistair was being escorted from the building, the final blow was being delivered across the digital landscape. Nora hadn't just kept the video for the wedding. She had released it to every major news outlet and social media platform simultaneously. The footage of Alistair slapping a pregnant kitchen hand 10 years ago became the most viewed video on the planet within an hour. The curiosity gap was gone, replaced by a global roar of outrage. The reputation Alistair had prized above all else was permanently incinerated. The major luxury brands he partnered with released statements severing all ties. The exclusive clubs he belonged to revoked his membership before he had even reached his car. This decision to prioritize his status over human decency had finally cost him his freedom to walk the streets unbothered. Nora watched the screens in the boardroom, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. She felt no malice, only a profound sense of vindication. She saw the comments flooding in, thousands of women sharing their own stories of resilience, inspired by the silent powerhouse who fought back with success instead of screaming. The billionaire justice atmosphere wasn't just about money. It was about the total shifting of power from the predator to the protector. Away from the chaos of the falling empire, Nora took Leo and Mia to the site of her newest project, the Whitaker Pediatric Center. The building was a marvel of glass and light, designed to provide the highest level of care to families regardless of their social standing. As the children ran through the gardens, their laughter echoing off the marble walls, Nora felt the last of the 10-year-old tension leave her shoulders. "Is this ours, Mommy?" Mia asked, looking at the plaque near the entrance that bore her own name. "It belongs to the city, sweetheart," Nora replied, kneeling down to look into those piercing gray eyes that no longer felt like a curse. "But it exists because you two gave me the strength to never give up. You are the real legacy." The twins finally understood that their strength didn't come from the Holloway name Alistair had obsessed over. It came from the woman who had survived the rain to give them the sun. They weren't nothing. They were the future of a dynasty built on empathy rather than arrogance. Nora realized that the ultimate emotional payoff wasn't seeing Alistair lose his money. It was seeing her children grow up in a world where they would never be defined by someone else's dismissive gaze. 6 months later, the world had moved on, but Alistair Holloway had not. He was seen working at a small, independent hardware store on the outskirts of the city, the very type of menial labor he had once mocked as trash. His silk suits were gone, replaced by a canvas apron that bore a striking resemblance to the one he had gifted Nora in his own home. Nora's car pulled up to the curb one afternoon. She didn't get out. She simply watched him from behind the tinted glass. He looked tired, his Ice King mask replaced by the weary lines of a man who finally understood the value of $1 and the weight of a regret. There was no hate in her heart, only a quiet, dignified peace. She had thrived while he had merely survived. She signaled for her driver to move on. She had no more words for Alistair. The silent powerhouse had said everything that needed to be said through the empire she had built and the children she had raised. She left him in the rearview mirror, a small figure in a dusty apron, finally living the life he had once predicted for her. Nora stood on the observation deck of Whitaker Plaza, the city lights below twinkling like a sea of diamonds. The billionaire justice atmosphere was now her permanent reality, but she wore it with a grace that Alistair never could. Leo and Mia stood beside her, looking out at the skyline with the confidence of heirs who knew the value of the ground they stood on. A final twist awaited as her assistant approached with a new file. "Ma'am, the man who helped Alistair hide the offshore assets 10 years ago, we've located him." Nora's eyes narrowed, a flash of that iron will returning to her gaze. The story of the Holloway collapse was over, but the story of the Whitaker rise was just beginning. She looked at the city one last time before turning toward the elevators. "Let's set all that aside for tonight," Nora said, her voice a warm, sophisticated melody as she embraced her children. "Tonight, we celebrate home." This silent powerhouse walked into the golden light of the elevator, the doors closing on a decade of pain and opening on a lifetime of justice. The story of Nora Whitaker and the fall of the Holloway Empire serves as a powerful reminder that the seeds of cruelty we sow today will eventually bloom into the justice of tomorrow. Little did Alastair know that by trying to erase Nora, he was actually forging the very weapon that would dismantle his life. Don't be left behind as the rest of our story family moves toward the light. Your presence here is what keeps this community of justice and hope alive. If you believe that no one should ever be made to feel like nothing, subscribe now to stay safe within our circle of truth and resilience. If you leave now, you might miss the next reveal that could change your entire perspective on what it means to truly thrive. This is Mr. James. Remember, you are precious, you are powerful, and your story is just beginning.